we are finally starting the fifth MezhyhiryaFest. Ребята, а нам в уши не идет. Нам в уши не идет.
Не идет.
Не идет.
А у меня вообще регулятор не работает.
We had the first one 5 years ago, and we never know when the last one is. It's a pleasure that this is happening every year. It's a pleasure that this has become a tradition, and every year we have many people who would like to attend MezhyhiryaFest. And the topic of this year's fest is corrupt assets tracking and recovery. Here we need to recollect the history, how the fest started. 4 years ago, the team of journalists on different issues was working here in this selling when we found out that when Yanukovych was running away, many documents were left and they were trying to drown them here in the Kiev Sea. And the group of 15, 20 journalists stayed to work here, and these were the documents on how the residence was built and all the documents related to Mezhyhirya. Then we copied these documents and we gave more than 20,000 documents to the prosecutor's office. The case on Mezhyhirya is still being investigated. We don't see any sentences on Mezhyhirya case, on some other ministers or civil servants cases. 4 years passed, and we believe that it's time to organize a revision. What happens with criminal cases filed in 2014, the cases against the politicians and the President Yanukovych. And this year we dedicate this fest to a certain revision. What's happening in the country with the recovery of assets, with what's happening with criminal cases. And during this fest today and tomorrow we'll be talking about the situation in Ukraine and about the role of journalists in such cases, and the special attention is paid to the international experience, because in different countries there was an experience when in Italy, for example, when mafia representatives of mafia were arrested, big assets were discovered, and what was done with that, how that was managed by the state. We'll be talking about Ukrainian experience, about international experience, and I hope that in the end of tomorrow you will know more than today, and you can use it in your life. I would like to present the first panel. We are assessing what happened in the last 4 years, Yanukovych's assets, what has been done in 4 years. Our speakers has changed. You know, we had to have the Yevgeny Yenin, the Deputy Prosecutor General of Ukraine. He will be presented by Andriy Lysenko. He's from the press service of the General Prosecutor Service of Ukraine. We also had to have another person, Anton Yanchuk, head of Ukraine's Assets Recovery and Management Agency, ARMA, but unfortunately we're trying to find out why they refused to participate, but we still have Katerina, who's the legal advisor to Transparency International in Ukraine, and Transparency International played an important role in building ARMY as the institution, and about all the contras and pros for this agency will be told by Daria Kalinyuk, and also we have Denis Bigus, the journalist from Bigus and 4, And 4 years ago, he was also presenting the position of the journalists. And I remember you were talking to the Deputy Prosecutor General, and the moderator of this discussion will be Sergei Lещенко, member of Ukrainian Parliament, the former investigative journalist who played an important role in what we know about Mezhyhirya and in opening it up for this society. I hope this will be very interesting. I would like to give the mic to Sergei. Good afternoon. This is so unusual that so unusual building. No, is it normal? It's not very good for the interpreters, basically. The sound is very, very bad, and Sergei says that the acoustics is very bad because when Yanukovych was building this hangar, he wasn't planning to invite journalists here to organize journalist festivals. That was for his yachts, and that is a technical building where they used not very expensive construction materials compared to what was used for his residence. And basically, if someone would say 5 years ago there will be no Yanukovych, this will be the place where people will come for some rest, young people, elderly people, or people will go and feed animals. If we would say that, maybe someone would say that probably you had too much of alcohol, and that is something that would never happen in life. But thanks to the fact that Ukrainian citizens said that dignity is more important for them than anything else, we had this revolution of dignity, and that has become the conference hall for journalists. Mezhyhirya is the symbol of corruption. When one person decided that everything is created for him, the assets which are state-owned should be his, and the money he steals from the state budget he can spend. That is the former state residence. And even Nikita Khrushchev lived here, but in any of his dreams, Khrushchev could think that he can steal some money, but Yanukovych stole a lot, and he did it via several offshore persons and companies, and this was owned by the member of parliament from his party, Sergei Kluyev, and that's how he was trying to hide who owns this facility. At the panel, we have wonderful participants, the investigative journalists and the representatives of authorities who can come to one conclusion together, because the fact that the assets of Yanukovych are to serve Ukrainian citizens, we agree all to that, and that. But the question is, how could that be achieved? How could that be done so that that doesn't become any reason for political PR campaigns, so that it cannot become the reason to file some case against people. I would like to, basically, I participate in conferences as participant, but I would like to ask Katerina, as the representative of Transparency International, what is your opinion on where is the problem with returning Yanukovych's assets? Because we've been discussing this topic. We were discussing this topic, and we would like to see some results. All money should work for Ukrainian citizens. Thank you. Thank you, Sergei, for your question. we can talk a lot, discuss a lot on the problem of return of assets, especially of Yanukovych's assets, but 4 years, as it has been mentioned, passed until now. There are no cases open against Yanukovych and his and all who were involved into corruption crimes, and to say nothing about recovery of assets. Look around. Unfortunately, now, till now, this hasn't worked. This hasn't been returned to the state budget, and the effective management of assets that, which are at least in Ukraine, not abroad even, this hasn't happened. We can ask the representatives of authorities, and we as the Transparency International Ukraine, we are trying to do that, but unfortunately, we don't see any result of that. To our mind, the problem partially is in the fact that the time is passing and 4 years have passed, but we believe that there should have been many cases in different judicial authorities. The evidence is lost, the traces in the schemes are lost. And talking about assets and their recovery, how to do it so that the assets are beneficial for the state. There are some positive changes. The ARMA was created, and that is the Organization on Recovery and Management of Assets. And they unfortunately do not return the assets to Ukraine. Their work is purely executive type of work. But their success, even though they have been in place since 2016, their success is not very demonstrative. There are many problems where the former defenders of corruptionists are trying to get the assets back, the assets which were arrested. You all know about Gulliver and other assets of Mr. Klimenko, which is arrested now and had to be managed by ARMA, by the state-created body, and bring revenues to the state. But unfortunately, this management is blocked. Some people come with weapons to this building and practically do not let the representatives of authorities to do anything. But at the same time, the bodies which are set up and which have powers which are to be very beneficial as just as ARMA, bodies like ARMA for a year, they can become really efficient, and they cannot take this institution of assets management to the level when the state would get some profit from that, some revenues from that. We can find many arguments saying that it's too early, the law enforcement bodies didn't have much time to show any results, but I'd like to emphasize that in fact, with each month, Ukraine and we, the representatives of civil sector, we are losing the opportunity to recover. We still do not, the assets, we still do not know how much was taken out of the country by Yanukovych. And I will not mention this 1.5 billion that were sort of returned to the budget of Ukraine by the General Prosecutor's Office. That's quite a disputable issue, but we hope that in the nearest future, all these negative trends which show, which the representatives of authorities show, they can change something. Let's listen to the position of the representative of the General Prosecutor's Office about that. We have one mic which is not working. This is much better. This is much better. That was the phone that was the problem. I would like to clarify that the case against Yanukovych is there. There is plenty of evidence, but there are no sentences. And as a journalist back in 2014, I was surprised that all arrests of the assets of Yanukovych, all these international sanctions that was happening not as part of the case on Mezhygirya, but that was within the case on Ukrtelecom, and how Yanukovych, being the president of Ukraine, initiated transferring the responsibilities from the private investor to the state to build a special network of some secret confidential communication. And this way 220 million hryvnias were spent instead of the private owner Ukrtelecom doing it all, and that was related to Firtash, but that was transferred to the Ukrainian state budget. Together with Daria Kaliniuk, we started working back in 2012 when we were among the 4 who signed the letter sent to foreign banks, to Austrian banks, with requirements to investigate what Austria was doing to hide Yanukovych's assets. But the paradox was, at that time he still was the leader of the state, but he was taking money out of Ukraine and was using foreign jurisdictions to get this money legalized there and then spend it. This residence, Mezhygirya, according to documents, was owned by Ukrainian company, but that was owned by Austrian company, Euro East, the company registered in Austria, and the accounts were in Austria. The same way one of the closest friends of Yanukovych, Andrei Kluyev, was also doing the same, following the same schemes, and together with Anatoly Gritsenko and another one, the 4 of us, we sent a letter to Austrian banks, and we were surprised to learn that Austria treated our address very seriously. And what happened then, Daria will tell you, because we found in Pshonka's house the answer from Austrian prosecutor's office that the case was filed, but because the general prosecutor's office of Pshonka said that there were no violations, it was closed. So does the West play important role? Does the West cooperate with the Ukraine to disclose such crimes? Because these crimes have a trans-border nature, because many foreign countries, foreign jurisdictions are used to legalize proceeds and for corruption crimes.
Good afternoon. The right balance. I would like to say that the West and civil society, these are two persons, two subjects which manage to see any bringing to responsibility of Yanukovych, just like Mezhygirya. Mezhygirya was brought back to the public property, not by prosecutors, unlike in other countries. Everybody knew that this property was gained by means of corruption by its owner, but but no action was taken. All the investigative journalists proved many times that these were corrupt assets, and again, nobody was brought to responsibility. Like Western partners in 2014 had imposed personal sanctions upon Yanukovych and his allies, his friends. Uh, till now, these sanctions are big problem for them, and for all those 4 years in the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, they have opened cases against the European Union aimed at proving that these were unfair sanctions. And Unfortunately, the European Court needs to get facts, proofs, and evidences from Ukrainian authorities, while in order to bring those people to responsibility. Uh, and they cannot get such evidences and proofs. In Ukraine, we have opened cases and opened investigations against Yanukovych and his circle, his allies. We managed to pass a special law when it is possible to have a case court hearings without participation of the mm, defender. About Kurchenko, about Klemenko, those cases were opened and heard. Recently, European Court extended sanctions against Sergei Arbuzov, and unfortunately, each year, because of failure of Ukrainian prosecutor's office to provide sufficient evidence for preservation of sanctions and for proper investigation, the list becomes shorter and shorter. The list of those upon whom the sanctions are put, and for example, this time we failed to prove that $1.5 million insecurities belonging to Arbuzov, upon which we had to impose sanctions. But unfortunately, later we revealed that these were not securities and bonds that belonged to Arbuzov, but to Kurchenko. And unfortunately, in result of all those transformations, the Kramatorsk court brought to responsibility and made sentences to Arkady Kashkin, the minor participant of all that schemes, instead of such big figures as Arbuzov, etc. All this was done just to satisfy public opinion and to pretend that they are doing something. Actually, the situation, the real situation looks like this. If there is a criminal group, we are interested to know who were participants of the group, who were major organizers of the group, and who in authority abused drastically their power. I have my own idea why the majority of persecutions, the majority of cases against Yanukovych and his allies failed. The Kluev's brothers, Andrei and Sergei, were investigated by 15 different financial investigative bodies. Financial investigative bodies had collected all the information about transactions done by the Kluevs all around the world, and all that bulk of information was provided to the criminal prosecutor, to the prosecutor's office. But among that information, there were no criminal investigations, since disclosures made by Leshchenko back in 2003, 2004, when he just wrote that they made criminal offenses when illegally signing some documents, etc. But I believe that in today's prosecutor's office, we have professionals who are eager to carry out investigation properly. But unfortunately, if they manage to do this, probably this would be a threat. There were to become a threat to some people who remain in power today. Some members of parliament, some members of government, and this is the explanation why we do not have any clear victories in terms of investigation of the corrupt cases of Yanukovych and his allies. Some 4 years ago, in this very premises, in that track, and 4 years ago, my elder son explored that track, and at that moment, I was unable to assume that 4 years later we would remain in the same position in respect of investigation and in respect of punishment for all those crimes, corruption crimes. As a journalist, I do not know who manages this very property today, and I would like to know that everything that what is done properly in line with legislation, and to finish with that Austrian case which Sergei mentioned. When back in 2014 we applied to the Austrian prosecutor's office, and they informed us, to our surprise, that the criminal case was opened. And of course, the Kluevs and their supporters, they hired all the lawyers to stop the investigation. And then, after the Revolution of Dignity, Austria was among the first countries which opened criminal investigations in all those cases. So our objective today should be to prove that all the bureaucrats, all the old bureaucrats who made corruption crimes, they won't remain unpunished, that they will be persecuted properly, that they will be sentenced finally through court. And we have a good partner, among Ukrainian authorities, National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and very soon we expect the National anti-corruption court to be established, which will punish all those people. Thank you. I would like to explain for the audience one important thing. Money laundering, this is a crime, but before money laundering, there should be quite often there is a predicative crime, that is the origin, the source of that money, criminal money. Quite often there's a criminal money which later are laundered, and in our case, Austria asked us to prove that before money laundering in Austria, because that fact, the criminal source of that assets had to be supported and had to be proved, while Prosecutor General Pshonka at that time responding to this request from Austrian prosecutor's office, he simply stated that there were no criminal sources of those money which later were laundered in Austria. And as far as I know, now in Austria they have no chances to prove the criminal origin of that proceeds. Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Andrei Lysenko as representative. Oh, sorry, Denis Bigus, not Mr. Andrei Lysenko, but Mr. Denis Bigus will speak. Since I forgot to give you the floor, please call me Lev Lещенко. Andrei, please excuse me. I will not put any criticism on you as a representative of authorities, but I would ask you to explain how it should be and whether we could expect to have fair justice in Ukraine or not. Thank you for giving this opportunity to speak to me. I would like to add that today's Mezhyhirya, it's not a symbol of corruption, but it is a symbol how corruption was ruined. Because in the past it would not be possible to imagine that we all come together in this very place and discuss the matters that we are discussing today. Now, as to the Prosecutor General Office, during the last 2 years, we are carrying out profound reforming of the Prosecutor General Office, and we can not represent this like a fly of a bird which appears and disappears in front of a window. We are carrying out everyday and persistent actions aimed at reforming of the prosecutor's office. We are making necessary decisions every day, from the day when Yuri Lutsenko was appointed as a prosecutor general. Maybe not so many people know this, but I can assure you that within first 6 months, when the General Inspectorate inside the prosecutor's office had been arresting dozens of prosecutors every day for corruption affairs, and today they make not more than 1-2 arrests per day. When I came to the prosecutor's office as the head of the public relations service, I immediately had put the task of public awareness as top priority for myself, and we try to keep the society informed what's going on. But when it comes to the assets that were withdrawn by Yanukovych to other countries, and we we have something to say. First of all, of course, we are very grateful to civic activists uh, uh, who pushed forward our legislation and supported passage of the law on restitution of stolen assets, of those assets which were withdrawn from Ukraine, mm, which now allows to bring back that assets which were stolen from Ukrainian people. During 2017, if you, upon your permission, I will mention some figures. So during 2017, we experienced 4 big successes. Um, we managed to bring back this park and property, Mezhyhirya, back to the state property. And this the High Commercial Court decision had brought back this property back. The decision was taken on November 11, 2017, and this was a big victory. The next, our victory was bringing back Одеський NPZ to the state property. It belonged to Sergei Kurchenko, and there were several lawsuits related to that Одеський NPZ, which is a huge enterprise. And those oligarchs who were owners of that important enterprises, and they had very qualified lawyers, high-paid lawyers, and it was not so easy to win this battle in court. The day after tomorrow, on June 11th, Odessa NPZ will be officially handled and will be officially returned to the state property. And this is the cost is approximately 5 billion hryvnia. Metallist Stadium and the Metallist Football Club. I won't tell you a long story of that fighting for the property, but the stadium was confiscated in January last year, while today, this year, it became the property of Kharkiv Oblast administration. And now about money. During the last year, we managed to bring back to the state budget 10 billion hryvnia.
In general, in total, during the time of that time, we returned 44 billion hryvnias to the state. We can argue how this money was used, but we can say that this money went to strengthen the defense capacity of the country. They were used to buy armaments, equipment for the National Guards, for the National Police, for the State Border Service. Some money were used to install new biometric control on our borders. To say that nothing was done would be not correct. Again, I would like to emphasize that the prosecutors' bodies are doing everything possible so that everything that was stolen is returned. There's a lot of resistance to that, but we are moving forward. Thank you. It would be strange if Yanukovych wouldn't have good lawyers, because he had a lot of money, and he has a lot of money. But now I would like to give the floor finally to Denise Bigus. I wanted to say Petrova Vasil, but no, Denise Bigus. You have to say, you as the investigative journalist, you know the background of all these stories, you know what's the position of the prosecutor's office, and the voices of civil society, not from TV programs, but you talk about that yourself, and you know the background better than any one of us. So who's uh, right, who's wrong here, and are all the accusations fair or not, and where there is a weak link in this system, where have you found it as the mostly informed participant of our panel? Okay. Uh, First of all, I absolutely don't believe into existence of some one truth or one lie. I just want to briefly tell what are my impressions on that. Look, when we are talking about returning of some assets or recovery of assets, we hear several things mentioned. We have 1.5 billion which are collected in one place. We have Mezhyhirya and the Odessa pre-port plant in Peze. But I cannot say that the return of Mezhyhirya to state property is what the General Prosecutor's Office did, unless 4 years ago Mezhyhirya were not physically returned to the ownership of the people. Today we would be probably following some long judicial process, or we would have registered the defeat. Sorry. On the other side of Kiev, on the north, we are on the north, but that's to the south. There's one more luxurious property, which is the second Mezhyhirya of Versailles. It was built as Versailles, just a smaller copy. It's the property of Ivanющenko, and that's the guy who everyone forgot. We are talking about Yanukovych, Kurchenko, and Klimenko, but there is Ivanющenko who was named for 2 years or 3 years, the right hand, the main pocket of the family. And there is this Mezhyhirya too. What's happening to it? In those days, okay, people did not go there. There's also Honka there. Nothing happened there. It's all re-registered. At least half a year ago, there was another re-registration taking place. It's all now re-registered to some company, and these companies are changing all the time. So what I mean, talking about Mezhyhirya, I believe there is a certain role of the General Prosecution Office, but that's not the return. The return happened back in 2014, and it didn't happen in the second Mezhyhirya. One more thing. I personally do not know much about legal processes. I understand that legal procedures are possible, but in principle, I like that from one account, the package of documents were returned to another account, and that's 1.5 billion. But I don't understand why a big number of people, a lot of people from Yanukovych's team has never been mentioned. Ivanющenko, oh, Kravets. Basically, the general prosecutor office had 5 or 6 cases against Zlochevsky, and they all are either closed or lost. And Zlochevsky, I believe that we can count that Zlochevsky is in Yanukovych's team. That's the person who basically generated money, and he's the owner of the second gas producing company in Ukraine. There are many more people who are who were not noticed, and I believe there is a certain connection between these recovered money, this 1.5 billion, and the fact that other people, the rest of Yanukovych's team, they are still in the shadow. Because, well, that means that we don't have any well-developed legal process. Here we saw that there's money, there's a simple chance to get this money back, and we got the money back. But here we see that everything's very complicated, and Zlochevsky wasn't really accused, and we basically don't take into account the assets of the family. We just quietly change the owner. This helicopter site, which was another site of corruption, it quietly was transferred to manager, the member of parliament from the BPP. What's his name? I forgot. We had the investigation, but I cannot remember the name. The manager's name is Moskovsky, but the MP, I forgot. Who is the first one to say? Yefimov. Okay, Yefimov. Once we're talking about assets of Yanukovych's team, there's coal. I don't remember the name again. And there are coal reserves which were resold, re-registered, and these were the reserves received by Yanukovych and people around him illegally. But I am really concerned that there are several key media points, but there's no system, the results of which we could see. Thank you, Denis. I will mention Ivanющenko. I will add to about Ivanющenko. I once told on TV that Ivanющenko was the supervisor of Yanukovych, the one who was supervising the state flows of money, and then he was responsible for Titushki. Then Ivanющenko filed the case against me to Pechersk court, and it got to a judge who was basically satisfied the interests of Ivanющenko 4 times before. And then I thought, okay, this lady again will confirm, will resolve the case in Ivanющenko's side. But then this lady judged it so that it was on my benefit, but then Ivanushenko appealed and he won the appeal case, and I was included into the list of the debtors. And then we went to the Supreme Court with the lawyers, and I am happy to inform you that last week the Supreme Court approved the resolution, the judgment, and approved the secondary consideration of the case, because the arguments submitted by Ivanushenko are very funny. They made linguistic expertise, and they showed that the word "смотрящий," the word supervisor, is the word from the prison jargon, and they said that because Ivanushenko hasn't been in the prison and the word "смотрящий" is from the prison jargon, that means that this word cannot be used. As to Titushki, they again said there's no evidence, but we sent the letter to the Supreme Court from Gorbatyuk, and he mentioned that they are checking Ivanushenko whether he was organizing Titushki, and maybe that was one of the arguments that the Supreme Court made a ruling supporting us, and that was that they just this is just to change the topic. We will have a session, a Q&A session, but before that I would like to request the panelists to answer the question, but that is within the time frame that we MPs have. Within 3 minutes we have to say about everything in the world, so please in 3 minutes think of, tell us what you think about what we are discussing. Katerina, you're from Transparency International, the organization which gives assessment of the corruption in the world. Is there more or less corruption in Ukraine after Yanukovych, and what needs to be done so that we are in the first 100 of Transparency International? Because now Ukraine holds 137th position. By the way, Honduras, that we are using in our jokes, has the position 139. It's in the group immediately following Ukraine. 3 minutes. I'd like to say that in any case, the progress, Ukraine is progressing, but to my mind, corruption, we notice more corruption. We talk more about corruption compared to times of Yanukovych. We know what's happening more, and both journalists and activists and other participants, they take it to public, all the schemes that we can follow. And I believe that's very positive, because now we can ask specific questions, but not just look for needle in hay. I'd like to mention that again, Mezhygirya that we are talking about is still divided. Part of Mezhygirya is under NABU, part is under General Prosecutor's Office, and they cannot transfer it to ARMA. And whether it belongs to people of Ukraine or not, it's still the question. The fact that we can enter it doesn't mean that it's owned by people. As to further actions, maybe we need to mention that this window of opportunities closes when the civil society, journalists believe in reforms in Ukraine and they can influence. Unfortunately, we believe, and the Transparency International and myself, we believe that we less and less can influence people who are in power. And I believe that that is quite a concerning thing, and we will get to the situation when people start thinking, people who have become experts in some spheres of the powers of the who are in power, and then New Zealand and Canada, they are leading in our list, but Ukraine adds several points every year, and I believe that those who are present here, the journalists and the activists, that's thanks to them because they continue to promote these ideas. Thank you for doing it within 3 minutes. And I will ask Daria, your personal assessment. Do we have more or less corruption? And another question to continue our discussion. Why we don't have less corruption? What's the problem? Some people say that the society, people are ready to pay small bribes and mentally we all people are ready not to have corruption on top, but between us we are ready to have it. So someone will say that we need some political factors or we need some bodies. You, as a person who's been researching this issue from the practical and scientific point of view, give us the recipe. The question is, and that's for the rating of Transparency International. This rating is influenced by people like Denis Bigus, and that's not the positive influence because that's the rating of perception of corruption. That's the rating which measures the awareness of people and citizens about corruption. And here we know much more about corruption now because we have great investigative journalists, and besides we have many new instruments where we can get information from. The e-declarations, the open registers of ownership, open information on public procurements, this is all. And the island of dreams for investigative journalists. If we have some foreign journalists here, they probably just are jealous or envy our journalists. But the reason why we have corruption is because there's the feeling that if you steal a chicken, you will be put to prison. If you steal 1 billion from a budget or a plant, then you are a successful businessman, an oligarch, a minister, a member of parliament, because basically you have to share that with Bankova, with Narizhnitska. You need to have several MPs to who you pay grants, several $1,000s a month. By the grant I mean the bribe, but that's probably the jargon of MPs. They call it the stipend, the grant. Yes, Sergei. Basically, they are paid for voting, and so that they vote for some laws which create monopolies for oligarchs and for some corruptionists. Basically, the non-return point will happen when people who are rich, who are influential, like Martinenko and Nasirov, will not just be taken to courts, will not just get nervous, but will be put to prison. And they will lose their assets. And their relatives will not be able to study abroad in the best universities of the world and will not be able to go for holidays abroad. And that's then the price of this risk to go into politics to steal will be higher than just to go and conduct businesses in the Western countries they do. And they will be just developing the real competition in the country. For that, we need the anti-corruption court. We need people to be put in prison. Next month, we'll be following how this court is being created, and we request you, investigative journalists, to help us in that, so that some villains do not get there. Thank you.
Thank you. I encourage you to think about questions because very soon we will have a Q&A session. And now my question to Andrei. Of course, I am asking the same question, whether we have more or less corruption. But in line with the sociology surveys, the prosecutor's office has the lesser trust in society than even maybe the parliament. And so the question to you, whether it's possible to revive trust. Thank you. For sociology survey that you mentioned, I would like to remind you that in in Ukraine we have many law enforcement agencies, not just prosecutor's office. We have newly established National Anti-Corruption Bureau, we have SAP, we have State Fiscal Administration, we have some others, some other law enforcement agencies, while people speaking about corruption, they believe that this is a general prosecutor's office which is responsible for everything in terms of corruption counteraction. This only proves that we have to carry out public awareness campaign and inform people who is responsible for what. On the other hand, I think that the perception that we have more corruption is actually the reflection that we are acting in right direction. We make more disclosures of corruption cases. We sometimes even arrest the figures related to corruption. We detain them and carry out investigation. During last year, we filed to court more than 8,000 cases about corruption, and doing this, we paid attention at all corruption cases, including tiny corruption like stolen cars or presented big sums of money, etc. If there is a criminal, if there is even a relatively minor crime but related to corruption, we should point out to this crime and file it to court. When in all cases of big corruption, we always try to investigate them. I can assure you that investigators and investigative judges every day, even without weekends and days off, continue these investigations, especially those which entail frozen assets, and foreign requests, like with Azara, with Klemenko, with Zakharchenko, whose assets and property are frozen abroad and are frozen in Ukraine. And we continue our investigations without any intervals. And we will continue our work unless we find, by the moment we find, we revive total trust of society. Because we believe that prosecutor's office should work more efficiently, and we will try to strengthen this efficiency. Now I'm going to Denise, mic to Denise, and please think about your questions to Denise. Those who will ask the best question to Denise will win the right to make selfie with him. Denise, some people used to say that when they don't know what to do. They go to sleep, and in a dream they find the answer. Let us assume that we have the same dream, and during this dream you find out what to do with corruption. So the first question to you, whether we have more or less corruption, and the second, how to find solution to corruption. The corruption diminished slightly. We have less corruption, while it had become more visible. Mm, what we need to do, or how we can find solution. I agree with Daria that we lack justice. We have big problem with justice. Uh, Corruption is corruption derives from poor justice. I heard the news today that in Kharkiv Oblast, in result of special operation, they had detained a 19 years old person who had stolen 800 hryvnia and got some drugs. And the second big achievement, that one smuggler smuggled 60,000 packs of cigarettes to Slovakia, and his car was confiscated and later was brought back to him, something like that. So when listening to such strange news, I ask myself a question. What is the reality presented or reflected in that news? That you should not be stupid. You should not be caught with 800 stolen hryvnia or with a small portion of drugs. And while if you smuggle 60,000 packs of cigarettes, but do this in a way that you are not caught, then your car could be brought back to you. So you should be simply successful doing any crime or corruption case. Uh, um, I would add one more case about special confiscation of some Yanukovych assets. It was confiscated because a person who allegedly did this, it had false person and sometimes the enforcement agencies, they do not apply simplified procedure for investigation of such cases. Frankly speaking, now the questions from the audience. We have assistants. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and the mic will be provided to you. In the first row here is the legendary Van Yakovina. You have better mic than me. I'm impressed. Now the question, I have rather primitive question, whether in 2 years the situation with corruption will become better or worse. Because listening to you, I started to yawn, not understanding what it what's going to. It will be better. Yes, we have some progress. The more we know about corruption, the better progress it is. And in 2 years, the situation should be better, I expect, but much will depend on elections. And I believe that it will be better in 2 years because today we observe some progress. The uh, uh, the issue is that when you deal every day with negative information about corruption, for example, you have slightly distorted picture. I think much depends on the prosecutor's office. We won't wait for 2 years. We are working today. It will be much better and better every day. And with support of our journalists, we will know more about corruption and about anti-corruption work. I encourage you to cover our successes and our everyday work. Now, all our positive changes could be correlated with tranches from IMF and whether this will continue. Oleg Peretyak, investigative journalist from Lugansk. After 4 years, we are still discussing Yanukovych and his surrounding. Now, my question to you, when we will start to investigate about today's people in power? We look at e-declarations and have a lot of property and assets that belong to people who should not get such big salaries, such big income to have all that property. And we do not have any successful investigation about those people. Last year, I had two interesting investigations about corruption in the Ministry of Defense when they take the land plots which belong to the ministry. They take it for lease, earn money, and earn illegally. I provided my materials to Lutsenko, and it ended with nothing. And the second investigative case was with Rotterdam Plus, which again was submitted to Lutsenko, and it disappeared somehow. The only thing I would like to remind you that today we have discussion devoted to Yanukovych because we're in Mezhyhirya, but I will give the floor to Lysenko. I know your colleague, Mr. Snigiryov, and we maintain quite close contacts. And once again, I would like to mention that in line with the new legislation, which I mentioned at the beginning, all the bureaucrats and investigations of the property which belongs to them is subject to Anti-Corruption Bureau. When these cases arrive to us, it's not our function to investigate the property issues of bureaucrats, and that is why we forward such cases to NABU. But what you mentioned about the defense ministry, the land plots, etc., and the abuses of power, now military prosecutor's office, they participate in investigation which continues, and security service of Ukraine, state fiscal service, economic department of the national police, all these units are involved into investigation, and we have submitted several warrants for investigation. And as far as I remember, this is competence of NABU. I'm Oleg Veremimko. I'm one of the anti-corruption projects coordinator. I'm listening to a representative of NABU, and it sounds for me like old Soviet times. Uh, After Maidan and our project attended Prosecutor General Lutsenko and his residence, which is rather big, and it is declared as one of the pieces of state property, and we directed um, uh, a letter about case of Mykola Svidotsky. We provided all them. We think that it was a court failure. This case is known to the European Court of Justice. We informed the prosecutor in our oblast, we informed Lutsenko, prosecutor general, and recently prosecutors the main person who was convicted by mistake, he was tortured, and he confessed that he made that crime, and instead of punish of those who had to be blamed, they are not punished, while you come here and tell us that everything is good. Thank you. Thank you for the question. I would like to ask a question. When those cases were when those cases started some 5 years ago, the case is 5 years old. 5 years old. Actually, that defendant, it was kidnapped, it was called, it was caught, it was kept in jail for 5 years. And all those who were involved into this case, they investigated, the prosecutor, the judge, all they probably received bribes, and now they live happily. I asked the question when the case was filed to court. I don't know. You did not answer me, and I do not know about this case. At the beginning of my intervention, I mentioned that we have been reforming the prosecutor's office for 2 years now, and instead of 16 people, we now have only 6. We are raising our efficiency. I will give you my contact details, and you will inform me in more detail about this case. Thank you very much. I would like to comment to all the journalists. It's of course very important to produce a good article, and but it's not enough. Having written a good article, please advertise this material either with a member of parliament whom you trust, or with the prosecutor's office, or with some government body which is responsible. Bureaucracy looks very alike everywhere in the world, and having prepared good article, please point out attention of the government bodies to this article. And try to establish contacts, for example, with prosecutor's office. This will become additional source of information for you. And Denis could be very useful. He can share his experience with you. Denis will finalize our panel with the information how they apply this approach in the journalist project. Thank you for your attention. Denis, will you please finalize, wrap up the panel? I would add a couple of words and actually continue what Sergei mentioned. If you have some investigation and you would like to continue the investigation after publication, you can find our TISNA project and Bigos and 4 and remain in touch with us, and we will try to follow up your publications. During a year, we traced back and followed up more than 70 different proceedings. Thank you for your attention.
Her presentation. Доброго дня, дякую за те, що мене тут приймаєте. Я одна із
European network, and what we're trying to give you here today is a hint of the situation that we have in our country, which is kind of a peculiar country in Europe and in the world, I would say, for two reasons. The first one is that we got some of the most powerful organized crime of the world, and the second one is that we're the only ones with an anti-mafia legislation. Serbia and the United States have kind of implemented a similar one, so they're following up. But we are the only ones that have such a complex and, I would say, successful anti-mafia legislation, also in terms of asset recovery. However, as you will see today in this presentation, we still have lots of problems, and the main problem derives from the fact that organized crime today is completely cross-border, much more than civil society and much more than institutions and like police enforcement. So what happens is that the Italian organized crime moves across the world already since 20 years, and the laws through which we try to counteract are not as effective. So let's get into that. First of all, it's a short brief about when we talk about Italian mafias, what do we talk about? It's mainly four organizations. It's Cosa Nostra, which is also what we call the mafia. It's the only one. Then we got the 'Ndrangheta, Camorra, and Sacra Corona Unita. Can I stand so that I read myself? That's better. Cheers. Here is a map of the country, and as you see here, the four organized crimes originate from the south of Italy. Cosa Nostra comes from Sicily, 'Ndrangheta comes from Calabria, Sacra Corona Unita from Apulia, and Camorra from Campania, where Naples is. However, this is very anachronistic because today our mafias have spread all over the country and in the whole world. From a historical perspective, the reason why mafias started to expat, it was mainly because of business. Initially, the Cosa Nostra got in touch with the US when the US had to free us from the Nazis. So they landed in Sicily and needed some support of something that was not the government. And there was a kind of resistance movement, so to call, which was the mafia. But however, with the first money flows that came in the country, the Cosa Nostra grew into a very powerful organization, which main aim was being a counter-state. So like the enemy of a state, a different type of state, which main aim was committing crime and gaining profits. For this reason, at the early 1990s, 2 judges were killed, blown up in their cars in 2 different occasions, and the state decided to react strongly, so the army was sent down to Sicily, and the Cosa Nostra was fought very strongly. In front of Sicily is Calabria, in which the 'Ndrangheta was not the organization that we have today. It was built up in family clans, but their main activity was basically it was like kidnapping rich entrepreneurs from the north of Italy and bringing them in the woods, in the forest that they have in Calabria, and that was like the main activity. However, at one point they were sitting on literally a pile of cash, which they didn't know what to do with, and when the Cosa Nostra started being, started being at war with the state, the 'Ndrangheta decided to reinvest this cash, and the first things they started doing, it was like getting into the drug business in a different way. Until that day, we usually mainly went to buy cocaine in Spain from the Colombian brokers. The 'Ndrangheta decided to cross the ocean and go directly to Latin America, and that made them literally the most powerful criminal organization that we have today. They are less bloody compared to Cosa Nostra. There's been no killing of judges or journalists accounted so far. Of course they kill, but they kill in a silent way, and it's only among clan members. And they literally choose business over blood. Today, not only they're present in each region of the country, but they're present in the whole Europe and literally at the 4 corners of the globe, especially, for example, in Canada, in the United States, but also in other parts of the Balkans, and so on and so forth. So that was like a quick overview to get you into the phenomenon. So the situation is that Italy over the years became quite good into tracking and confiscating assets of our mafias. But unfortunately, as they're present in the 4 corners of the globe, majority of their assets are not in the country. They are either hid offshore in companies, complex company structures, which are very hard to track, or they're like in real estates and other kind of business all over the world. And unfortunately, because we, although, for example, especially in Europe, we collaborate with countries like Germany, France. Today in Italy, where counts from like the 80s until today about like 30,000 confiscated assets. Tomorrow, Giulia from Libera NGO will explain you more about that. But we cannot say similar success in other European states. This year, we did have some success with some countries like Germany and France, but it's really not putting up to the situation. For example, we as journalists consider Germany really a heaven for them. And one of the problems is that, as said, Europe and the rest of the world does not have an anti-mafia legislation, and the mafia-type association crime is not foreseen. So what is the anti-mafia law? Basically, it was passed in 1982, after 2 murders, and the state decided to include this felony, which also gives powers to, well, investigators can do more than like standard investigation. Perhaps we can wiretap people. So if I have a family and I'm the main subject of investigation, the police can tap all my family, because usually mafia clans are family-based. So that is part of the powers of this anti-mafia legislation, but also it gives power to seizure of assets, which means that if I am a mafia boss and I have a house in my wife's name, the state will be able to confiscate my wife's house. And in the legislation, we have a specific crime, which is the 416 bis, which is the mafia type association crime. Then last year we were, like the anti-mafia code changed slightly because it added also the corruption crime. So now we can confiscate assets also based on corruption. For what concerns confiscating assets abroad, those few successes that I told you about, they always have to pass through different crimes. So for example, a mafia boss has real estate in the UK, I will need to show that he also did other crimes that the UK can recognize. For example, money laundering, drug trafficking, or stuff like that. It will not be enough if Italy asks, look, I want to confiscate this asset because of mafia. The UK will say, well, you know, it's not a crime over here. There's been a famous situation in which a mafia clan from Calabria was having like a meeting in Germany. They were around the table and they were doing more than a meeting, was an affiliation ritual. They were actually turning some guys into mafiosi, and the Italians asked for the Germans to arrest them all, and the Germans said, well, this is not a crime. I mean, in Germany, you can totally do that. So again, this is what we're saying. Now we also have this corruption crime, especially also linked to the public administration. So if we have a mayor stealing assets, we will be able to confiscate. This is, okay, again, a description of the mafia type association. We need a group of at least 3 people, so a couple will not make a mafia type association. But instead, usually mafia clans are family-based, so it's kind of easy to prove more than 3 people. And also from an analysis point of view of the way it works, the aims are always that of course, producing as much profit as possible, but also to influence politics, to control society, and to basically be like a counter state. So I put together 2 cases for today, just because I think they're a good example. One is Vito Nicastri. He is known as the Lord of Winds because he literally was the largest entrepreneur of solar and wind energy of our country. He was an engineer, and he became the most rich green energy entrepreneurs of Europe, I would say. And he was based in Italy. However, the state managed to prove that his immense power and empire was not his own money. And that's why it was possible to seize it and ultimately confiscate it. The story goes with, in 2009, he was arrested for stealth public funding, and they proved that he had that illicit gains. And then he was arrested again for illicit competition. In that case, they could prove that not only he's obviously gained money out of doing things not in a perfect legal way, but more than anything, this is Nicastri. But more than anything, the money he was investing and he used as like the initial capital to grow so big, it was coming from Matteo Messina Denaro. I don't know if you ever heard his name, but Matteo Messina Denaro, which by the way, funnily, denaro means money in Italian, but that's his real surname, it's just out of chance. He's a Cosa Nostra boss, and he's been on the run for the last 25 years. He's hiding somewhere, nobody knows where, and he's like literally the fugitive. Our cops are looking for more. So at one point we managed to confiscate, the authorities managed to confiscate all of Nicastri assets. Literally, it was all the assets. He could not prove it was his. Because in our probes, if I say that you're favoring the mafia and you don't know how to explain all the assets and money you have, then I can confiscate those assets from you. And it was the largest so far. It's 1,300,000,000 euros. So it's a lot of money. They were mainly, we come back to that, they were mainly divided into 43 companies, 100 real estate, 7 cars, some boats, and 60 bank accounts. This is a pizzino, which proved the connection between Nicastri and the mafia boss. Pizzini are some small notes that the mafia bosses who are fugitive usually use to communicate so that they cannot be traced or wiretapped. Much better than Signal. This is just a funny thing that during the investigation, at one point he figured out that the police was trying to track him, but he was kind of confident because most of the assets were offshore. We're going to see in a minute. Lots of them were passing through Luxembourg, Malta, and other havens. But at one point, his accountant calls him up and says, hey, they actually got their hands on a specific bank account. And he said, well, if this is the case, we're fucked. And in fact, he was. This is the thing that I briefly explained before. How is possible we could confiscate assets before trial? Is again, basically, if you cannot explain why you have all those assets, we have something called preventive measure. We can let the state can take all the assets away, kind of freeze them, and then it can be taken away from you, even if the trial kind of favors you. Like some people have been acquitted from mafia-type association, but still their assets were mafia money, therefore they've been taken away. And this is a case like that. Just like last month, basically, he was, 2 months ago, he was arrested again because not only they proved that the assets were from mafia money, but also he has been favoring the hiding of Matteo Messina Denaro. Adding to the story, we investigated with ICIJ, the consortium based in Washington, some years ago, how the largest solar panel producer of China, called Santec, now it's bankrupted, basically was investing in our country, and he used a few brokers, and these brokers were connected to Nicastri. And all of the money that was passing through the deals, which were defined, not completely illegal, was passing through offshore, like Luxembourg, Malta, and so on and so forth. And we could see literally how our investigators and the courts could not understand the full picture of what was going on. And the reason for that is, I'm gonna now get into another case. The reason for that is that, unfortunately, lots of states, like Malta is one of the worst in this cases, are not collaborating. So, unfortunately, like we journalists, we can just call up a friend and say, hey, can you check this company for me? Or, like, can you actually walk there and see what's in that office? But our police cannot do that. They have to ask for either like a European arrest warrant or like a rogatory to like do investigations, and majority of cases, they never get a reply. Like literally never get a reply. So this example, I mean, it could fit Germany and many other countries. I'm using Malta just because this is an investigation we published with the OCCRP just last month within the Daphne project framework. I don't know if you heard of it, but it's basically 18 news organizations got together to continue the work of Maltese journalist who was killed, Daphne Caruana Galizia. So in this case, we investigated this company that is an online gaming company, and we've been following Centurion Bet for, I think, 5 years. Because Centurion Bet initially was based in the UK. It was called in a different way, but it was managing this brand, Bet1128, which operates kind of in different European countries and also in the rest of the world, like in Latin America. And basically they were operating from London, but the guys who managed it came from London gave me some pounds. From Apulia, do you remember that region in the right-hand side of the country? So where the Sacra Corona Unita is based. And at one point, the Italian investigators managed to prove that this company was managed illicitly with funds coming from the mafia. So they went up to the UK institutions and they got a permit to seize the asset, which was very good because in other cases the UK authorities were not as keen to cooperate. However, when the investigators went up to London, what they figured out it was an empty box. Why? Because the brand was sold with all the valuable assets to a new company established in Malta through nominees. The real owner of Centurion Bear is Francesco Martiradonna. He is the son of a convicted mafioso from the Apulia mafia. And again, what we've been proving with the investigation that we just published is that he never went out of the scheme. But obviously he got clever enough to put nominees. So that was about like 2014, 15, when we started tracing this guy. We could not write black on white that he owned the company Malta. So he had like a bunch of engineers that were like tech guys that were the same ones from before, so obviously it was suspicious. But because we get lots of lawsuits, we never reported like, okay, he owns this company. And we waited until last year, like last summer, there's been an anti-mafia probe that confirmed that the company Malta was his. How? Because they were wiretapping them. And in the wiretaps, it was very clear that he was the owner of the company. He was deciding everything about it. He was traveling all over the world to like sell services. So obviously, he was the owner. How was the company, operating in an illegal way? Basically, you can register an online company anywhere in Europe, but you can't use, for example, if I register a company in Malta, I cannot open bet shops in Italy and use that company because that is illegal according to our regulators. These guys were doing that and adding an extra edge, which was collecting the bets in cash. So basically, anybody will enter the shop and just give 10 euros, place a bet, and walk away. If they will win, they will get a win in cash. It's not just the case with Centurion Bed, we have loads of companies doing these kind of things. One entrepreneur in Palermo was doing this and he was collecting 15 million euros cash per month. And obviously it became like an ATM for the mafia because anytime they needed, the bosses needed money to pay lawyers or to pay the guys in jail, any of this stuff, they would just walk to the bet shops and get money. Right, so, I think I jumped a bit, yeah. So, as said, in May 2017, they all got arrested, and then there is an authority called MGA, that basically suspended all the licenses of the company. However, this is not law enforcement. So the MJ can say, well, the company cannot operate anymore, but the assets remain in place. Therefore, basically our police, our court, said, okay, these guys have lots of millions and we want to freeze them. And they asked for Malta to freeze the company. They did it in July 2017, never heard back. So then in January this year, they asked for the company to be seized again. And nothing happened. Basically, they never got a reply from Malta. Although the Italians were saying, please do it quickly, because we know that from Malta they move the assets offshore to like the BVI or where else. Right, so nothing happens for months, no answer. We email the prosecutor in Malta and he says, oh no, I seized the assets. And it's like, okay, really? So we called the Italians again and the Italians said, no, actually we never heard back. So it's still unsure whether the assets were seized or not. But a big question is, if they seize it, what have they seized? Because when we walked there, the office, like Centurion Bed, was not there anymore. And it was a new company with the same guy. I mean, the same former director of Centurion Bed was sitting there doing cryptocurrencies. So yeah, the big question is, have they seized what? Bank accounts, assets, real estate? No idea. Following our investigation, the Italians seized 7 betting shops in Calabria, just to kind of enhance the measure. But at the moment, I still haven't heard from the Maltese.
So to summarize, the Italian police are good at seizing assets that are in Italy, but not so good at seizing assets outside.
No, they don't have the power.
So it's exactly the same in Ukraine. The police managed to seize Mezhyhirya, but really struggled to work with law enforcement agencies in other countries. In the United States, exactly the same with Lazarenko. They managed to steal his house in California, but not his property in Antigua. So if the problem is multiple jurisdictions, is that also the case in Latvia?
Yes, actually, it's okay. The Latvia isn't very good at seizing assets stolen in Latvia, but our authorities showed some skills to seize the assets probably stolen here in Ukraine. And I would like to talk about the case I worked on, what happened to the money which was arrested in the Latvian bank accounts in the 2014. As most of you probably know, that in the 2014, in the March, EU decided to freeze assets of 18 Ukrainian ex-officials and businessmen. The persons were subject of criminal investigations going on here in Ukraine for misappropriation of the public funds. And 1 month later, the Latvian body responsible for fighting money laundering detected 29 offshore companies and 70 million euros were frozen in the bank accounts of 3 Latvian banks. Yes, from the total figures, this 70 millions isn't big, but it's quite a big number for such a small country as Latvia. So, and who were the possible persons behind that money? I rely on the sources in the Latvian law enforcement agencies, who's been in a very, not to say very good, but in the contact with the Ukrainian authorities, and the Ukrainian authorities gave some information to the Latvian law enforcement agencies. And of course I rely on the publications by media here in the Ukraine. 23 of those offshore companies possibly were linked with Serhiy Arbuzov, former Prime Minister of Ukraine. Arbuzov himself denied it, but in the bank accounts of those 23 companies, $5 million and some euros were arrested in the private bank. The bank has Ukrainian ties in its ownership structure. 3 offshore companies might be linked with Yuri Ivanushenko, former MP from the Party of Regions, and $30 million on the bank accounts in Regional Investment Bank, also the bank with the Ukrainian origin, but registered in Riga in Latvia. And 2 very well-known, I suppose, offshore companies here in Ukraine, Prosperity Developments and Suprema Trading, linked in Ukraine with the businessman Serhiy Kurchenko. US Treasury at the beginning of this year published a report regarding money laundering in the ABLV bank, which is was the 3rd biggest bank in Latvia, and US Treasury said that Kurchenko used ABLV to channel billions of dollars to the 9 shell company accounts. But as you can see, in this case, there are some pocket money left in the Regional Investment Bank. And one offshore company, T-Star Management, I couldn't find the person behind it, not from my sources in Latvian law enforcement agencies, not even in Ukrainian media, and almost 200,000 euros and almost $400,000 on the bank accounts in ABLV Bank were seized in 2014. Till 2016, there were no information in the Latvian media that so influential persons from Ukraine could be linked with the arrested money in Latvian bank accounts. Nobody just paid attention. And we actually came to it by accident. Ministry of Finance organized a meeting for the journalists regarding budget revenues, and in one of those slides we saw that there were written something around 50 million euros revenue from the confiscation of criminal means. It seemed quite a big number because usually it's something like a 1.5 million per year, and now they are planning 50 million. And the Minister of Finance wasn't even aware about this. She couldn't provide any details on it. She said that Ministry of Interior are planning a big snatch or something like that. And so I started to work with the sources in Latvian law enforcement agencies and figure out that there is an active criminal procedure going on, started on 2014, and the possible crime is money laundering. And in that particular case, Latvian police is cooperating with the Ukrainian authorities, and information about the involvement of Kurchenko, Arbuzov, and Ivanushenko came directly from the Ukrainian side. But the problem was that Ukrainian authorities cannot provide strong enough evidence that the money was stolen from the Ukrainian budget. There were some evidences that the money is linked with the Ukraine. Just one detail, that the transactions were made from the computers with the Ukrainian IP addresses, and there were some other evidences, but no clear evidence that it was stolen from the budget of Ukraine. And Latvian authorities decided to confiscate the money, 70 million euros in the smaller portions, for the purpose of state budget. So why did Latvia decide to take the money? I would say that we have a pretty progressive code of criminal procedure when it comes to the confiscation of such an asset. Code allows to decide the question about the confiscation even before somebody is plead guilty, and the two conditions must be fulfilled for that. There is, first of all, there is a set of evidence that the seized assets has a criminal origin or it's linked with the crime, and the second, that the transfer of the whole criminal case to the court in the near future is not possible. Decision is always made by court, and it is decided in closed hearing, and findings are confidential. It's because the criminal procedure is still active, and only prosecutor can decide what amount of information are given to the other sides of this procedure. I have read some critics about this procedure, mostly from the lawyers whose clients have been in such a position, but Latvia has this kind of regulation almost 10 years in the criminal code, and the main idea behind this that crime doesn't pay. It means that you should act fast and not allow to gain from those assets the persons who might stole them. I would say that such a procedure is not very common among other countries, but we can still see some of the main idea. I think in Italy could be the same, that you can take even before the sentence the money out from the organized crime. But still, the legislator was pressed to make some changes in the criminal code. Because one offshore company, Imex provider, here in Ukraine, it is linked with the Ivanushenko. Imex provider lawyer refused to disclose who are the beneficiary of this company, but here in Ukraine it's linked with the Ivanushenko. They went to the Constitutional Court of Latvia, and they achieved the second hearing. And the question about the 25 million euros is not decided yet. We have a joke that this could become a Latvian know-how because we have a lot of dirty money in our banks, but sadly there are no other good examples when our authorities could manage to confiscate them. Usually it's something like 1.5 million euros per year, and it's the sum of many small cases. Thank you.
Сейчас у нас будет Владимир, будет говорить по-русски.
I'm from Moldova. Vova from Chisinau. Those who do not know, Moldova is very small one. It's next to Ukraine. Between Ukraine and Romania, we have two neighbors, but despite the fact that we don't have many neighbors, we have many people who want to get money in Moldova. And my question is dedicated, my presentation is dedicated to one question. Where's the billion? I mean, $1 billion that was stolen by authorities from the people of Moldova. That's the meeting at the central square of Chisinau. After we learned that $1 billion was taken out of 3 Moldova banks, people went out to the square. We didn't have Maidan. Basically, people demanded return the billion. The people organized mini Maidan. They put some tents. They were demanding to return 1 billion. But that billion was taken out of 3 Moldova banks under the guarantees of the government. Unde miliardul. That's to translate from Moldovan language, from Romanian language. I am Vladimir Tchorik, I'm from Rise Moldova. The investigatory center. We are members of OCCRP, International Consortium, Global Network of Investigative Journalists. We investigate Panama Papers. We cooperate with Ukrainian colleagues. So what's this 1 billion? Unde biliardul? How were they taken out 1 billion from Moldova? I will show you one of the schemes, which is the easiest one. I called it Moldova Limoniada. You all know that how do people call 1 million? Lemon. They call it lemon. And we will organize some game with lemon. We have Latvia. Latvia was one of the biggest countries where said money from this Moldova billion went to Latvia. This case is called the stolen money. Well, Sicilia will be the government. A lemon. Two lemons. This will be the state budget. The microphone. I am the Moldavian company. I have patrons who are politicians. I come to the Bank of Moldova and I tell them, give me 1 million as the credit. They tell me, give us some collateral. We are not bandits. We are working on euro integration. All the final stage of the scheme was taking place in 2014, the year when in Ukraine Maidan started and Moldova signed the association agreement. And that is why we got this visa-free regime before Ukraine got it. So what were the authorities doing? They organized this scheme, one of the episodes, how they were stealing. That's the company close to politicians. I go to Moldovan bank and they tell me, give me 1 million, and they tell me, give me some collateral. I say I have some assets, take these assets as collateral. Okay, I take this million. What do I do with this million? I can eat it, or I can put it on deposit and we take it to Latvia. Hi, Latvia, how are you? Your brothers, Moldavians, brought 1 million to you as deposit. We trust you. But give us a paper confirming that I have a deposit. I have it. I take this piece of paper, the document that I have a deposit. I go to Moldova Bank. Give me 1 more million. Again, I take the second million to Latvian bank. And the scheme was called Carousel. And these empty pieces of paper, I take them to Bank of Moldova, and give me all your papers which are worth 1 billion. These are basically empty papers. They had more than 100 of them. They took them to different banks. These are empty liabilities, not insured by anything. That's it. Then what to do next? The Russian banks were involved. Who's that? A stub bender. Who knows that the real prototype of a stub bender was in history? Who was the prototype of this literature uh, character? Osip Shor, Odessa criminal. In Moldova, we have our own Shor. Here he is. He's Ilan Shor. Ilan, his last family name is Shor. 3 banks from which they got 1 billion were owned by him. He's a young guy, born in 1987. He's sentenced to 7 years, but that's just the court of the first instance. He appealed and he's still not in prison. He was elected primar of the mayor of the third inside city, and who besides him was involved into the scheme of taking 1 billion out of the country. Vladimir Filat, the former prime minister of Moldova, he wasn't the prime minister then. He was put to prison because Shor says that Shor gave him bribes worth $250 million. The prime minister was put to prison. In Moldova, people believe that Shor is used as just a stick to remove some political competitors. This businessman was put to prison. That's his interview to us. He said, "I'm sorry, but you all stupid." And he was sentenced to 18 years of imprisonment. In the end, Shor is not in prison. He's married to, that's singer Jasmine, Russian singer Jasmine. If you love pop music, that's his wife. Everything's good there with him. So basically, who's to be blamed? Then the government of Moldova was a trustee for these billions that were given to Shor, basically so that there's no panic in banking system. They gave him $1 billion as assistance to banks. But this money was taken out of the country. The prime minister of that time, when this all was happening, he was saying, "But I was just the prime minister, what could I do?" But that's absurd, but that's so. They tell to people that. Then Kroll, the detective agency, started investigations, but most of the names which are included into Kroll's report on who was involved, who was making decisions, who was influencing, all of that is top secret, confidential, and they don't tell people who stole this billion. Most often they talk about Shor Group. In all Kroll's reports, they publish the open part, but the politicians, the civil servants who participated, who made decisions, they are hiding them. Why? The current Prime Minister Philip says, if we publish all the names from this report, I can tell you that 90% of these people are honest people, but they were just involved. They just accidentally stole 1 billion. That's why we cannot make these names public. The list of these detective agencies, that's why the government hired this detective agency to find out where this billion went, to what countries. And he says that all will be responsible, our laws working, and for 4 years we've been looking for this 1 billion, but they cannot put civil servants to prison. The money went to Latvia, thank you. Latvia, we will still need these lemons. Thank you, Latvia and other countries. Basically, 200 million, according to Kroll, are still in Moldova. Kroll sent a request to all these jurisdictions where this money is, and they received some replies. From Moldova, they did not receive a reply where the money, how the money was used. Moldova hired Kroll, but they don't reply to where money is. Where was this money invested? We investigated it. We have such a person, Vladimir Plakhatnyuk. He controls the political, economic life of Moldova. Where the money was, how the money was used. They could be used for paying for charter flights of the current president Dodon. He was flying to Moscow, and the charter flight are owned by Plakhatnyuk and Shor. And then different charity events, charity things. The bread, which is 10 cents, that's a real photograph after Shor was sentenced to 7.5 years of prison. He created the party and started opening social stores in Moldova. And he's selling bread to pensioners at the price of 10 cents a loaf. He has social cities, and people just pray to him in the city where he organized this party. Now they buy votes for this 1 billion. The logic is everyone steals, but Shor stole part of the billion, but he returns some money to us in the form of cheap bread. We cannot hear, unfortunately. It's 5 times more expensive. He opened these social stores for pensioners. People go there, buy bread and butter, and everyone says, okay, he stole, but he shares what he stole with us. By the way, in autumn this year, there will be new parliamentary elections, and the question, how do they return this billion? This way, we'll get the authorities who will have money, who will be buying people for cheap butter and bread. That is why the journalists are saying, where's this billion? And they conduct investigations, but we hope that we will be able to find some money with the assistance of foreign colleagues, because some money went to the UK, to Latvia and other countries. And the concert will go on disco. We want disco. By the way, the question is, this billion should be returned by people. people are to return this billion. In Moldova, we have 3.5 million people registered. How much should everyone return? Who will get millions? How much? Okay, what's your name? Svetlana has become the millionaire. Every citizen automatically, when the authorities stole $1 billion, basically every citizen has to pay $300 for that. And for this money, they will be buying people at the elections. Thank you.
Я хочу поставити запитання, а ви спробуйте відповісти, як зможете. Це дуже цікаво.
Every year in stashed offshore is about just over $1 trillion. So in fact, this scheme of $1 billion is happening 1,000 times all over the world every year. So where is the $1 trillion? And what should we do about it? Which is an interesting question. I think, can we start with Latvia? It was noticeable in the case with Mykola Zlochevsky that the British investigators felt that they had been let down very badly by the Ukrainian prosecutors. That the Ukrainian prosecutors essentially, they wasn't sure whether they had been incompetent or corrupt, but they hadn't provided any information that their British colleagues needed in order to freeze the money and maintain the freezing order on the money in London. So the money was released and the case was destroyed. You have 50 million euros which could have been returned to Ukraine, but which stayed in Riga. Do you have any insights into how well the Ukrainians are doing and what the Ukrainians should be doing in order to get the money back?
Actually, I haven't seen the decisions by court because the hearings are closed. I spoke with the investigators in the state police. Unofficially, of course, nobody came public about the cooperation between the Latvian and Ukrainian authorities, but the one investigator described the cooperation interesting. He used the word in that sense that Latvian side sent a request to the Ukrainians, please give us information, more details about that, and to many requests there wasn't even a reply. And after that, when there were headlines about the 50 million euros that the Latvia seized, I remember that the Poroshenko met the Latvian president in the United Nations. They discussed the case, and there was opinion that both countries should cooperate and work together. And they made an impression that maybe in the future there will be some changes, but we haven't seen them, and I think it just don't work that way. We don't have, I think, any examples when one country confiscating money, give it back to other. It's very good if the country where the money is stolen, if they could keep it. Usually they are not freezing most of criminal proceeds.
Владимир, а скажите, вот ваши правоохранительные органы, которые не могут найти ваш лично миллиард. Они не хотят найти его, или они не могут? Как думаете, они просто некомпетентны, или они вообще нечестны?
В Молдове есть такой орган, государственный орган, Центр по борьбе с коррупцией. Этот центр, у него в онлайн-режиме видны все транзакции. Я заплатил как-то за Facebook $100, с моей карточки сняли, мне позвонили с этого центра, говорят, какая-то подозрительная у вас транзакция. Из Молдовы выходило сотни миллионов лев, ну то есть десятки миллионов долларов. И никто в эти банки...
And they called to me and said there is a suspicious transaction, but when $1 billion was paid, $1 billion went to other countries, nobody asked the question about suspicious transactions. So all those banks requested for state guarantee for their loans, and the government issued such a guarantee. Now in internet we have the information which indicates how much that billion is being recovered. Now all those 3 banks are liquidated, and they're selling the assets of those banks, like premises, cars, etc.
The world need to do to stop this happening? How can we get better at taking the money back from bad people and giving it to good people?
Yeah, the first part of the question was how the world does it. Well, I think one of the starts, especially with the European Union, it would be to pass an anti-mafia legislation, because that would already, well, that would be a first step. And then you will need to also enlarge it to not just mafia, but also corruption. But already, if the EU as a whole considers the fact that the organized crime groups, not just the historical ones that, like, for example, those of Italy, but also like new ones being born. You also have like the motorbike riders and other organized crime groups. You got the Serbians, I mean, you got the Albanians, there's a lot of them. And there is no way to stop them at the moment because the EU hasn't passed legislation. There's been talks, like MPs meeting like many times, but they still haven't come up with a good law. So I think that would be a first step, because then it would allow, first of all, to do investigations, like cross-border investigation, so the change in jurisdiction won't stop prosecutors. There's some of the anti-mafia prosecutors, like some of the best ones out there from Italy, say that what we need is a European anti-mafia prosecution office that can actually investigate with like special police forces from each country, like got together and work on cases, kind of like reporters do, but in a law enforcement way. So I think that would be a start, because then you can do the investigation, track assets, and move from like Moldovan banks into Latvian banks to the Italian companies, perhaps re-laundering money and so on and so forth. And I think though as well, civil society and journalists have a role besides authorities to do more and more tracking and more cooperation, because that's, I guess, the only way through. Like, we have to see what criminals do and do the same and get better.
So there you have it. The secret is that you guys need to work more and better because everyone else is incapable. Sadly, I think if the case of Pavlo Lazarenko teaches us anything, it is that it's best to think that once the money is gone, and it's never going to come back again, which is a shame. But there we go. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes. I don't know if any of you have questions for our wonderful guests. And if you do, you can ask them. Anyone questions? Please put your hands up. Hello. Do we have any microphones? У нас микрофоны где-нибудь есть? Вообще. I don't know if these work. Вот здесь, товарищ.
У меня вопрос к Владимиру. Вот вы показали нескольких людей, нескольких там стрелочников.
People who were not important participants in the case, but they were put to jails because of that stolen 1 billion. What was their actual role? Whether they were just some minor participants in the case, or they were just innocent people who were arrested and put to prison. And what is your understanding who are final beneficiaries of that? Again, play a role game. I am Bogatyuk, who is an analog of Yanukovych in Moldova. He is a hybrid of Yanukovych and somebody else. His rating, his negative rating is 90% among population, but nevertheless he controls the government, the parliament, and law enforcement agencies, and he has built out the mafiosi octopus, and his favorite movie is about an Italian mafia, you can imagine. Let us imagine that I am Pakhadnyuk, this person. I am Filatov, minister, who was put to prison. You are Mr. Shor. And you are Platon, who later also was sentenced to prison. Mr. Shor has banks. We all decided to steal 1 billion. You are Platon. Platon has to design a scheme. Your bank will steal the money, and while I am Pakhadnyuk, who will keep an eye on our anti-corruption center and force them to withdraw $1 billion dollars from the country. You are former Prime Minister Filat. You are my political rival, and I want to remove you from political arena, and I ask Shor to whistleblow about you, that you have stolen something or paid bribe, or that you took bribes. And so Shor whistleblowed about you. You are put to prison. Then I advise Shor to whistleblow about Platon, because he's our business rival, business competitor, who invented the scheme how to steal $1 billion. So you also whistleblow about him. He is put to prison for 16 years. And then I say to you, let us create a party together, and we will get political dividends and be happy. and having created the populist party, he disseminates cheap bread to people. Who is the winner? I'm the winner because I have stolen 1 billion. I have created political party. I sell to people cheap bread for 10 cents, and they are happy. I'm happy too. So everybody knows that Plakhatnyuk is to be blamed for this scheme in Moldova. Plakhatnyuk positions himself as pro-European politician, while our president in Moldova now takes the pro-Russian stance and Plakhatnyuk uses these fears of population that Dodon, current president, will take full power and that Moldova will become fully pro-Russian state. That is, Plakhatnyuk positions him as a pro-European politician, the only guarantee against Russian tanks in Moldova. So he actually puts people in front, allegedly, puts people in front of choice, whether you support me and like me, or you will see Russian tanks in our streets. Actually, we were in a situation of war with Russia. And now we are in a deadlock situation, actually, in Moldova. I don't know what is the way out. What is the most tragic in this situation? That $1 billion are stolen, but it's not the end. These money are used to change, to undermine, actually, our electoral system, to intimidate our or to curb out our democracy in the country, and I don't know what will be the end.
Dharma is just stupidity.
My question is to Cecilia. As we know that last time Italy received a new government, and what do you think about the government? Can they change the fight against corruption, against mafia, and is this politician can continue to do this very important work? Thank you.
Right. I try not to be personal about this. I mean, it's not very easy because I haven't voted this government. So, to give you a hint, our new Ministry of the Interior, he's very active on Twitter, and he does like Facebook, you know, like, how do you call it, direct, yeah, Facebook Live. So I think at the moment he still hasn't figured out that he has to like start doing something practical. At the moment he only like campaigns on Twitter. But the other day he came up with a wonderful picture with, so we have 3 different police forces in our country. One is police, that is a civil law enforcement, so like what you would call cops, and then we have the military police, they're called carabinieri, and then we got the financial police, and they're also part of the army, like the Ministry of Defense. And they don't like each other usually, so it's, everybody in Italy knows the distinction between the 3 bodies. And he took a picture that like 90% of the people there was carabinieri, so from one thing. And he tweets tagging police, which is like, God damn, this is our new interior minister. He doesn't even know the difference between the 2, like the 3 entities. So that doesn't look like a good start. the party he belongs to, Northern League, has been investigated in the past for having laundered money, illicit gainings in Africa through diamonds, although they're particularly racist, but apparently they're racist in Africa only with the poor migrants more than, they don't seem to be racist towards African diamonds. At the same time, they've been found on a few occasions, some of their members have been found supported by and linked to the Calabrian Mafia, so the 'Ndrangheta. At the moment there is no evidence of any wrongdoing, but Salvini, who was the Minister of Interior, he won the elections through basically the votes he got in Calabria. So we think it's a worrying scenario. For what concerns the other part of the government, the Movimento 5 Stelle, at the moment there have been no investigations from journalists or authorities into possible links to the mafia. Although, a few characters, but they've been always sent out of the moment when they've been found. Prosecution, like the anti-mafia prosecution, is quite independent from the government, so at the moment we think that it will still work well. But obviously we have to see in the long run, in the long term. If they're cutting funds too much, then we already have a very worrying situation, especially in the south. The state is present in very little amounts. The police that lives there, the majority of them is young guys. They come from different regions and literally have no life, because some of the villages in which they have the police headquarters are all the people living there literally belong to mafia families, so those young cops have no way of, even playing football will be a problem. So we have to see how it goes in the long run. It seems that, generally speaking, the new government speaks a lot about security also making it harsher for mafia bosses, although we already have harsh terms in jail. But in the concrete terms, it doesn't seem they really know what they're talking about, and it seems that they're only focused on we already had an international political crisis, because even before the government was approved, Salvini came out with this wonderful comment that Tunisia is sending criminals to us, and I think we have to kindly remind him that yes, it's true, but the amount and entity of the criminals that we sent to Tunisia, which are the mafia bosses who are hiding there, is kind of a bit worse. So we have to see. Definitely, as investigative reporters, we have our eyes open.
This is very cheerful. Anyone else? Oh look, there's a gentleman in the front. Hello, sir. In the middle.
Matisse, my name is Robert Homans, and I've been living in Ukraine for a long time, and I've been following all these issues. I have an accounting background. I'm interested to ask you if when you talk to your colleagues in Latvia, do they give you some reasons why they think their Ukrainian counterparts aren't providing this information? Is it because they just won't do it? Or is it because they don't have the capacity? And by capacity, I mean putting together the accounting information along with a story that would be able to present a case to the satisfaction of the Latvian authorities that this money was indeed stolen.
I think it's more the capacity issue, and also I noticed that after I made the first story about the confiscated money here in Ukraine, they started. One person said that the other didn't do the job properly, and also there were allegations from one institution to the other, and it could be also the reason that if the persons were so influential here in Ukraine for so long time, they still have some control over the authorities, right? And it's so easy for them to say, just don't answer the requests, right? And when the first amount of money was confiscated by the Latvian state, it was. I thought that the persons behind the money, they didn't fight very hard, but now we see the last year, maybe more, there are really tough fight in the court, anonymous, because we actually don't know who are the persons behind the companies. Actually, it's prosecutor's office against the one offshore company. The offshore company is going to the constitutional court, going to the lower court, going to the Supreme Court, and the fight is very hard. Maybe they didn't notice when the first money was confiscated that Latvian authorities are capable to do it.
I think we might be done. Thank you everyone for listening. Thank you. There was we could have music. Can we have music now? We're going to have music later, which will be more cheerful anyway. Thank you for listening. Спасибо вам большое. Дякую.
Thank you. Дякую нашим спікерам, дякую за цю панель. Зараз у нас спів. Власне, буде кава.
Now we have half an hour break. At 6, in half an hour, we'll be back. We'll have a special movie screening. We'll show the story on why criminal cases are not moving forward. Come back at 6, at 7, we'll have the awarding ceremony for National Investigative Journalism Award.